Advanced Studio Classroom is on the air. Today we learn about a man who left an incredible legacy in the comic world. Welcome to the month of May. You are listening to Advanced Studio Classroom, and my name is Brandon. Today we begin our People article. We're talking about Stan Lee's legacy. And here in the studio with me today, we have two panelists. First, welcome Gabe.
Hey, everybody. Yes, I'm very happy to be here. I think I'm experiencing a little bit of a cold, so if I sound a little bit like the actor Sam Elliott from A Star is Born... forgive me.
Well, at least that's a movie that's relevant. So, it's like we put on accents or something like that. Anyway, well, thanks for clearing that up. We hope your cold clears up as well.
Thank you.
We also have Manya here today, I think in your normal voice.
Yes, I'm normal.
All right. Welcome, Manya.
Thank you. And that's funny, my voice started changing. But I'm happy to be here.
Manya, are you into comic books or comic movies or superhero movies?
I like it okay. I would not consider myself a super big fan.
You have to leave. You only like it okay. I'm just kidding.
I mean, I love it. I like it a lot.
Well, I'm kind of in the same boat as you, Manya. I'm not a big, huge superhero movie fan, but I think Gabe is the one in the studio who is the bigger fan of superhero movies. Am I correct?
I've seen almost all of these recent Marvel movies.
That's a lot.
Over the
they
last
make one
decade.
like every week.
I know. It seems like they do. Yeah, starting with Iron Man. That's
Iron Man
my
movies. Favorite. Mm-hmm. Iron Man.
Yeah, actually, he is my favorite too.
Wow.
And then Ant-Man came out, and I was like, wow, this guy's got a sense of humor.
I haven't seen Ant-Man.
Yeah, it's fun. I didn't see the sequel with the Wasp, but yeah, I am a big fan of these action movies.
Why?
Do you know why? Because they're not just action movies with superheroes. They're actually really funny. Mm-hmm. I mean, they double as comedies.
Yeah,
it's
that's
almost
right.
It's almost like action movies are the preferred funny movie these days.
That's true.
Yeah.
And they just keep making them. There's been, I don't know how many Spider-Mans. Really, there's been a lot. Now, I saw like a couple of the Avenger movies, or how many are there? Three,
lot.
4? I don't know.
I'm not sure.
Anyway, I've seen a couple of them. The first one I really liked, and then the more recent one, it was just overstimulating. Just so many different plot stories intertwined that
Infinity War?
I was like, I don't know how to keep up with all this. It was too much. Way too much for me.
I saw it in the theaters. It was overwhelming.
Right?
It was great, but it was also really overwhelming.
Yeah.
But you have to see the sequel, Endgame,
Coming out.
which is out right now in many countries.
Oh,
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll have to go get our tickets for that. I guess we're really keeping up with things, Manya. Anyway, Gabe is keeping us on track here. We are talking about Stan Lee's legacy and 3 ways he helped create the modern superhero movie. Now, even if you're not really into superhero movies, it is interesting to look at the story behind it and this man who had a huge impact and the legacy that he left. By the way, that's an important word and thought for us, to consider. What
Stan
will
Lee?
be our legacy?
Legacy.
You can think about Stan Lee as well, but legacy. What will be our legacy? What will we leave behind? That's something we can take from this as well. Well, we have a lot to talk about today and tomorrow, so let's get started. We are on page 10. Right now, we'll have our first reading down through line 8.
Stan Lee's legacy. 3 ways he helped create the modern superhero movie. By the time the Marvel Cinematic Universe experienced its big bang with the 2008 smash Iron Man, Stan Lee had long since retired from official duties at Marvel, settling into a role as a revered spiritual grandfather to the comic book world, as close to a flesh-and-blood superhero as fans could hope to get.
All right, well, We are talking about Stan Lee, and we learn here by the time the Marvel Cinematic Universe experienced its Big Bang with this smash Iron Man, which we were talking about back in 2008, Stan Lee had already retired. So let's talk about a few of the words here in this sentence. First, Manya, we have this term Big Bang.
Yes. So Big Bang means a beginning, a powerful beginning. And in this sentence, they're talking about how this fantasy world, the Marvel Universe, really started with Iron Man.
All right. And that is probably my favorite of the superhero movies. Why? Well, I just think it has an interesting storyline. And it's more... I want to use the term down to earth. That's not really correct, but what I mean by that, it has more human involvement. Like some of them, like Thor, they're on another planet, and I'm not a huge sci-fi person, so I lose interest when that happens. But when they're on Earth, I don't know, I like things that are going on Earth because I can relate to them more.
I think I like Iron Man too, and I think part of the reason is because of Robert Downey Jr. He brings that down-to-earth sense with him. I think a lot of people can relate to Robert Downey Jr.
It's a unique sense of humor, but it's funny.
And he's just very human. Obviously he was a human that became Iron Man, this superhero, and not the other way around. Not like Superman, who had to disguise himself as a human.
Yeah.
Manya,
you didn't tell us. You said you only like these sort of, or it's kind of high-how for you. But what is one of your favorite superhero movies? Like if you were one was coming out, what would you really prefer to see?
Ooh, okay. I really like the Captain America movies because it's historical.
Not because he's handsome.
Sure, and because he's handsome. Yeah, but I think for me it was the story and the time, the setting. It took place during World War II, and I just thought that was so cool.
I need to go back and watch those. I've only seen like part of it. I was watching it on Netflix
only
or something, and I stopped. You start watching something on Netflix, and then you lose interest.
It's a good one.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, well, so we saw this Big Bang because of Iron Man, and Stan Lee had already retired at this point. But he is looked up to, isn't he, Gabe?
That's right. Well, our lesson says that he retired, but he kind of assumed a role as a spiritual grandfather, perhaps a mentor of sorts in the Hollywood comic realm, and so when they're creating these films, I don't know what goes on backstage, but I'm assuming they spent a lot of time talking with him, consulting with him about the direction they should take, and they probably took a lot of his ideas.
Yeah, and he's described here as being revered, which means he is greatly respected. And then that term spiritual grandfather might sound kind of strange, but I think mentor is a good replacement for that. And so people basically really respect him in the comic book world and also, the superhero world, I guess. And he is as close to a flesh and blood superhero as fans could hope to get. What are they getting at with that statement?
They mean that he's very real and he's a living person because obviously superheroes are not real.
Flesh and blood meaning human.
Yes.
Right? And so he's kind of like a hero to many people.
Yeah, and I think the idea is that fans could hope to get, right? So the idea is that fans really do appreciate watching superheroes that seem human as well, and they're not just, an otherworldly power, but also someone that they can relate to. And obviously, because Stan Lee is a human, so he really as close as people can get.
All right. Well, what kind of impact did he actually make? We learn more about that as we get into our second reading for today. We will start in line 9, go up to the right column through around, 5, 6, 7, 8, line 8. So join us for our second reading, and we'll come back for an interesting discussion.
A lasting impact. But though Lee was no longer actively involved in steering the panoply of characters he had helped create, including Spider-Man, the X-Men, the Hulk, Black Panther, Thor, and the Fantastic Four, his legacy as a key architect of what would quickly become Hollywood's dominant genre was already firmly established. Thank God for Stan Lee creating this universe and these amazing characters, David Maisel, former chairman of Marvel Studios, told The Times. as news of Lee's death at age 95 reverberated around the world. Here are 3 ways Lee helped write the playbook for the modern superhero movie, and by extension, reshaped the film industry as a whole.
All right, a lasting impact. So here we learn more about what Lee did. He was no longer actively involved in steering the panoply of characters he had helped create. So let's just stop there. It's a long sentence. And so what does the word panoply mean, Gabe?
Yeah, I like this word, actually. It's a wide range of different things. So, obviously, in the Marvel universe, in the Marvel world, there are so many different superheroes and different types, some like Manya mentioned before, some that came from history, like Captain America, and people that change shapes, like the Hulk and Iron Man, Black Widow. Yeah, so there's a panoply. There's a wide range of characters.
All right, a good word to know. So Lee was involved with this. He retired, obviously, but his impact was still there. His legacy was as a key architect of what would quickly become Hollywood's dominant genre. Now, what do they mean, Manya, when they say a key architect?
So because he was one of the creators of all these superheroes, he was, in a sense, an architect. He built these characters.
So basically, he did a lot of hard work. He built this all up. And so he retired, but it kind of continued on, right? And so that's a testament to the work that he did.
Exactly. And I think that speaks to a lot of people who, might retire, that their work still continues on and that their legacy still goes on. And it's a great thing. And so Stan Lee obviously is a key person. It says, I like this here, it says he's not steering the stories anymore. So he has hands off. He has intentionally, not tried to control everything, but he is still there as kind of a mentor, as a key person that people still look up to.
Right. Yes, and that was the role that he had until he passed away. So we have this dominant genre, and I think that's a perfect way of describing this because we see Marvel movies coming out all the time, don't we, Manya?
Yes, I feel like at least once a year, maybe.
At least.
Yeah, there are a lot of
if not
movies.
more. Yeah. There's a lot out there. It's hard to keep up with. But he, helped to steer this, and then when he retired, it kept going because he did such a great job. And then we go up to the next column, and we hear from former chairman of Marvel Studios, and his name is David Maisel. And he said, thank God for Stan Lee creating this universe and these amazing characters. And so, again, we see how grateful people are.
Well, right. And so, yeah, I'm really grateful he has, too. And I think it's, this genre has been around for a while, like the superhero genre. I mean, at least in comic books for a long time. With Superman and Batman, and I know that's DC Comics, and they're somewhat competing companies. But the idea is that there are a lot of people I think that we can thank for amazing superhero characters.
Well, you mentioned the different companies there, DC Comics and Marvel. Seems that Marvel has really taken off, and we still see movies from the DC Comics, but why do you think, Gabe, that Marvel has been so much more successful? I'm
not sure why. Perhaps it has to do with Stan Lee's legacy, and I think our lesson touches on it a little bit in the next section here when we talk about how human and relatable these characters are. But yeah, like you said, there are a lot of DC movies that are out these days as well. The Superman, the League.
Justice League.
The Justice League.
Yes. There we go.
Exactly.
Yeah, but it's interesting to see how Marvel has really, taken off, and there's so many movies, and we get into this in a bit, but, there's they intertwine a lot of different stories, right? And that's what I saw in the last Avengers movie, where they bring all of that in.
Yeah, and like you said, it can be kind of confusing. And when they try to cram so many stories into one movie in 2.5 hours or something like that.
But I think a lot of people like that. You're always trying to do better than the last movie and make it different and more interesting, and I guess that's their attempt at that. For me, personally, I like it to be a bit more simple.
You like the individual stories, like Iron Man. It was just about him and his journey.
I can focus on that,
But I can understand if you're a super fan and you've really invested in all these characters, to see them all come together and have something so complex that only a really dedicated fan would understand would be really satisfying.
It would.
And by dedicated fan, you're probably talking about people who actually read all the comics, right? And like are trying to figure out how the movie stories match up with the comic stories, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Did you all read comic books or when you were a kid?
I've read a few.
Okay. Yeah, Calvin and Hobbes. But that's not...
And Peanuts.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a little different.
That's different.
I've read some of the Superman or Spider-Man, just a couple of those.
Yeah. Those are comics that Gabe and Manya were referring to, that you see in the newspaper, like a comic strip or something like that.
Right, yeah.
So a little bit different, but those are fun too, right? All right, well, we know that Stan Lee passed away recently, and the Times are talking about the Los Angeles Times. David Maisel was talking to them, and they're also saying as news of Lee's death at age 95 reverberated around the world. So he lived a long life, reached age 95. We would all be very blessed to live those until that age. But this word reverberated.
It means affected in a really big way. I always think about how, if you throw a pebble into the water and it just has a lot of ripples and it goes on forever, sort of like that. The news of his death just affected a lot of people.
Right. When people heard it, they know who he is, and they were affected by that, and it went all the way around the world because he's a famous person, obviously. Well, here are 3 ways Lee helped write the playbook for the modern superhero movie. Now, when I think of the word playbook, I think of sports. I think of especially maybe like American football. They have a playbook, right? And there are many different plays. Maybe many of you don't watch American football, but there are some kind of complicated plays that they have to do, and they need to memorize those, and so they have a playbook.
It's
and they
their
practice
strategy,
those.
right?
It's strategy, right?
Yeah, but this here we're using in our lesson, we're kind of borrowing that term from the sports realm, right? To talk about how Lee had influenced the superhero movies.
Yeah, so kind of wrote the playbook, the strategies involved for the modern superhero movie, and by extension reshaped the film industry as a whole. Now that term by extension, we're connecting these two ideas, right? If you say by extension in this sense, there is a connection with something. And so we see that he wrote the playbook and then by extension reshaped the film industry as a whole. Because he was so involved with writing that playbook, it reached further. He also reshaped the film industry as a whole. We use that term sometimes, Gabe. What do we mean as a whole?
Yeah, sometimes we mean in general, but also here I think it means on a grand scale. And so the idea, I think, is that he had wanted to do one thing, which is just focus on the superhero movies and books, right, or the stories. But then he ended up, perhaps by accident, influencing all of Hollywood. All
right. Well, he did have a huge impact, and he also made superheroes relatable, which I think is a huge reason why Marvel is so successful. We learn about that as we go to our last reading for today.
He made superheroes relatable. Until Lee came along, superheroes had generally been much more like Olympian deities than regular people with regular human problems. But starting in the 1960s, Lee and co-creator Jack Kirby saw a way to draw in fans with characters who, for all their powers, were plagued by the same flaws, neuroses, relationship issues, and everyday headaches that beset all of us. As Lee told the Times in 1984, "I thought, suppose there was a guy, Peter Parker, who's also Spider-Man, And he can stick to walls and spin a web and has the strength of 12 men. We said, just because he can do that doesn't mean everything would be perfect in his life. We created the first superheroes who weren't perfect, who worried about paying rent. It was satire, fantasy in a realistic setting.
All right. So superheroes in the past were more like gods in a sense, small g gods. We see Olympian deities is what they were referred to. That's what people thought of as they're superheroes. They're supposed to be perfect, right?
Perhaps the first one that comes to mind is Superman. I mean, because and Superman's a great story. I think it has a good parallel actually to the real universe as well. God coming into the world, just like he actually did 2,000 years ago. Some people would think about that, but again, Superman was originally a god-like person, right? And he had to disguise himself as a human. I also think of, I don't know if you guys ever saw the cartoon He-Man.
Yeah.
That's who I think of. I don't know why. He just seems like really big and, I don't know, muscular, and seems like nothing's going to go wrong with him.
Exactly. So that's what people thought. And they use this term Olympian deity, Olympian referring to kind of godlike, and deity is also another word for a god. So instead of thinking of them as regular people, but things began to change with Stan Lee, and we have problems, and we sometimes think of a superhero as not having any problems, but that began to change. Starting in the 1960s, Lee and co-creator Jack Kirby saw a way to draw in fans. And what did they do, Manya?
Well, they made sure that they had human flaws, that they dealt with difficulties in the way that a lot of human beings do.
Now, do you think this is kind of risky for them to do this? Obviously, it worked, but anytime you're changing something, it's a risk. There's a risk involved.
Yeah, you're probably right. I haven't thought about that before. Yeah, you're right. I think when you're making a big change in an industry, you probably have to convince a lot of people that it's going to work. And he found out in 2008 that it worked.
That's right.
Right?
So
but even before that,
Yeah, they created characters who, they had powers and stuff, but they were plagued by the same flaws that we may have. You're plagued by something, that means it causes you a lot of problems. And then they use a more technical word here, Manya.
Neurosis. It means mental disturbances or like a mental illness,
right?
But not in a very serious way.
Right. Maybe like you have a lot of anxiety, or you have a lot of insecurity, or something like that. And so you could see that in these superheroes, which you can relate to that because we all become anxious at times.
Yeah.
And they have relationship issues, that for sure we can relate to, and everyday headaches that beset all of us.
Yeah, so I mean, I think of Pepper from Iron Man. She became his wife after a while, but yeah, they had a lot of relationship issues that kind of came in throughout the movie. It kind of made it humorous, and definitely relatable.
And it made it, like other movies in a sense. Like you go watch a movie, of course, there are relationship issues. So it brings in other elements into the movie, and I think it appeals to a broader audience. So I think that's smart. Well, as Lee told the Times in 1984, suppose there was a guy named Peter Parker who's also Spider-Man, and he can stick to walls and spin a web and has the strength of 12 men. And he goes on and he talks about, he can do all of this stuff, but that doesn't mean everything's going to be perfect in his life.
Right, exactly. And so he wanted to create someone who was a human first, and then who kind of became this superhero from whatever means it was. I think for Spider-Man, in different movies anyway, it was maybe if there was spider bite or something like that. And then he became this person who had all these superhuman strengths and powers.
Yeah, and I like what he said following this. He said, we created the first superheroes who weren't perfect, who worried about paying rent. He puts it in terms that we can understand. And what I love about this is that, we can all relate to the fact that they have problems, But we see someone who has problems doing great things, and we think, well, maybe I can do some great things as well, right? If the superhero who can, do these things, well, maybe I can do some things. Yeah, I can't like spin a web and do those things, but there's some great things I can do too. I think that's why it's relatable as well.
Yeah, and I think sometimes people believe in a fantasy that everything has to be perfect in order for them to meet their goal or do something to reach their dreams. But the superheroes here, you can see that they're not perfect, yet they still get to do things that they want to do.
Right. And Stan Lee describes this as satire. What is satire, Gabe?
Yeah, well, our definition here in the magazine says it's a way of criticizing people in a humorous way, or a play or writing that uses that kind of style. And yeah, that's true. I think anytime you see satire, you can see that the intent of the writer is to kind of poke fun at life or the way that modern society perhaps, or the way that we expect things to happen.
You see this maybe in politics. There could be a show poking fun at something in the political realm. You see that a lot.
Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of what Stan Lee wanted to do with his stories, was to create this kind of satire.
Yeah, and he describes it as fantasy and a realistic setting. So we're bringing these two worlds together, the fantasy world and real life. A lot of people, they would be maybe all about the fantasy if they're really into that. But when you add the real world to it, I think you open up to so many more people.
Yeah, I think so too. And, something I was thinking about when I read that line, he said, we created the first superheroes who weren't perfect. Like, I thought of Batman. He's not part of the Marvel Universe, but I always liked Batman too because he was a human who had to deal with his fears, and he became Batman. And so in a sense, that idea has been around for a long time, but the recent Batman movies that Christopher Nolan directed, he has a lot more of that human relatability and a lot more problems and issues that we can kind of relate to, just the average person can relate to. And that came after Marvel had created
that impact. Well, and I think it's just interesting. It's cool to watch that contrast, right? This lady can do all of these things, has these superpowers, but they also have problems that in their own life that we can relate to, that they can't overcome. It's kind of funny. It's like, they can do all of this, but they can't overcome, paying their rent, right? So it's kind of funny to see that contrast, and it makes the plot much more interesting as well. Well, tomorrow we have more to talk about concerning Stan Lee and his legacy. We hope you will join us for day 2 of our People article. Until then, this is Brandon.
I'm Manya.
I'm Gabe.
Saying goodbye.
Goodbye.